The warriors arrived on the 1st of May, 1763. Leading them was the Ottawa chief Pontiac. The commander of Fort Detroit, Major Henry Gladwin, received them warmly. When they left, however, he already suspected they were up to no good. And 10 days later, his fears were confirmed. Pontiac attacked Fort Detroit. This marked the beginning of a siege that had little in common with the positional warfare typical of European sieges, but instead followed the logic of frontier warfare. Warriors moving through forests, brutal ambushes, treacherous stratagems, swift maneuvers, torture at the stake, and even the use of fire ships all characterized the fighting. The attack on Fort Detroit marked the beginning of a wave that swept across the British settlements and forts of the Great Lakes region. During the conflict known as Pontiac's War, numerous tribes rose up against the British in an effort to drive soldiers and settlers from the region. Within a matter of weeks, they raided dozens of farms and villages, expelled hundreds of settlers, and captured 9 British forts. This is how modern historiography tells the story of the Siege of Fort Detroit and the beginning of the Pontiac's War. But before we get into how this conflict began, a brief word from today's sponsor, World of Warships. World of Warships is a tactical, team-based naval game that you can play for free on PC, and it's also available on console and mobile. The game features more than 850 ships from 13 nations, many recreated using historical documents and original blueprints. With destroyers, cruisers, battleships, aircraft carriers, and submarines, its 5 ship classes each offer a different way to fight. Right now is the most generous time of the year to join, or return to, the game. The Holiday Convoy runs until the end of January and lets you earn tokens through combat missions or by converting steel, research points, and coal. You can exchange those tokens for 11 rare, epic, and legendary ships, including the legendary Tier 10 cruiser Kitakami and the brand new epic US Tier 10 battleship New Jersey. Personally, I'd probably go for the New Jersey. You can also earn up to 18,000 doubloons, and you don't have to play every day to get something from the event. If you're new, use my link and the invite code IMPACTFORCE for additional rewards and to progress even faster. You'll find the link at the top of the description and in the pinned comment. And now back to 1763. In the early 1760s, a prophet traveled through the villages of the Ohio Valley. His name was Neolin, and he belonged to the Delaware tribe. He preached that the Native Americans had angered the Great Spirit by allowing themselves to be corrupted by the European way of life, and that this was the cause of the wars, epidemics, and crop failures they had suffered in recent years. To regain the Great Spirit's favor, they would have to turn away from the Europeans, return to their traditional ways, and renounce white trade goods, alcohol, and European weapons. Neolin's teachings found a receptive audience because many Native Americans blamed the crisis they faced on the Anglo-Americans, who were pushing ever farther west. Soon, this message began to shape the spiritual life of numerous tribes and alter the political climate. Discontent spread among the tribes of the region. The British themselves played a major role in bringing about this shift in sentiment. Geoffrey Amherst, the British commander-in-chief in North America, pursued a hardline policy toward the Native American population. Since conquering the French colony of New France in 1760, British forces had steadily expanded their control over the occupied territories, particularly the Great Lakes region, known at the time as Baie au Nord. Although they had promised in the Treaty of Easton only a few years earlier to remain for no longer than necessary, they expanded their forts and trading posts across the frontier and sent an ever-growing stream of settlers westward. Before the arrival of the British, the French had generally treated their Native American allies with respect. They traded with them, exchanged gifts, and largely stayed out of their internal affairs. The British took a different approach. Many believed that the Native American peoples should submit to British rule. Amherst sought to end the practice of gift-giving, insisted that trade be conducted at fixed prices, and regarded it as a natural right to the British to settle the conquered territories and cultivate the land. The conduct of the British so deeply offended the Native American population that many came to long for a return of the French. However, Jeffrey Amherst did not concern himself with this, as he believed these quote-unquote savages could pose no real threat to his soldiers. To be on the safe side, he restricted the sale of weapons and gunpowder to them in order to limit their capabilities in the event of an uprising, without considering that these weapons were also essential for hunting in peacetime. The Native Americans saw this, rightly so, as a clear sign that the British did not view them as equal partners, but instead sought to subjugate them. One man was particularly troubled by Amherst's policies, the Odawa chief Pontiac, who held great influence among the tribes along the Detroit River. In the autumn of 1762, he began advocating armed resistance, as did many other chiefs. Ironically, the spark that finally set the rebellion in motion was the news of the end of the war between France and Great Britain. When the British announced in 1763 that the 7 Years' War, and with it the struggle for North America, had come to an end, many chiefs regarded the announcement with suspicion. At the remote outposts of the frontier, there were, of course, no official documents to confirm that the treaty was real. As a result, many Native Americans believed the British had simply invented the peace to conceal a French counteroffensive and prevent them from siding with the French. In reality, there was no counteroffensive, but the hope that the old allies might return was enough for many chiefs to take up the hatchet. On the 27th of April 1764, Pontiac announced that a war council of the Odawa, Potawatomi, and Wyandot on the Ecorse River that he would attack Detroit. The fort was not only located in the heart of their territory, but also served as a hub of the British outpost between the Wabash and the Michilimackinac. Only Fort Pitt and Fort Niagara were of comparable importance. Pontiac delivered a fiery speech, voicing his anger over British treatment of his people, and finally presented the other chiefs with a wampum belt that the King of France had allegedly sent him as a sign that he would return. When he finished, loud cries of approval broke out. It was a warm Sunday afternoon in early May when Pontiac arrived at Fort Detroit with 50 warriors. The fort's commander, Major Henry Gladwin, awaited them at the eastern gate, greeted them warmly, and invited them inside. Pontiac explained that they had come to strengthen their relations and underscored his good intentions by performing a peace dance with several of his companions. The remaining warriors used the time to walk through the fort and to scout it out. The walls of the complex consisted of a 4-meter-high palisade with a parapet walk, and 3 projecting bastions extended the garrison's field of fire. Fort Detroit was strong, but the guards were few. The atmosphere was relaxed, and the gates stood wide open. What Pontiac's scouts had seen was so promising that the chief convened another council of war the very next day. The allies gathered in a Potawatomi village. To ensure the British learned nothing of their intentions, they sent all women and children away and posted guards. Pontiac then laid out his plan to the other chiefs. He intended to capture Fort Detroit with a stratagem of war. On the morning of the 7th of May, the Potawatomi and Wyandot surrounded the fort. They took up positions where they remained well hidden, but could intercept any reinforcements. And anyone attempting to flee would run straight into them. Pontiac then returned to the fort with 60 Odawa warriors, acting completely at ease, as if it were just another friendly visit. Their weapons were carefully concealed beneath their coats. When Pontiac entered the fort, he was astonished. The garrison was apparently not as unsuspecting as he had assumed. The fort's 2 schooners were patrolling the river, and at the gates there were at least twice as many guards as during his last visit. Nevertheless, the chief continued on, only to discover that the cannons were trained on key positions within the fort, and finally to come up on a large contingent of redcoats under arms on the parade ground. Gladwin greeted the chief warmly once more, but the menacing barrels of his men made their message unmistakably clear. Major Henry Gladwin was a veteran who had earned his stripes in the 8 years of war against the French. He had been in command of Fort Detroit and his 120-man garrison since the summer of 1761. Over those 3 years, he had built an extensive network, and it was this network that allowed him, despite Pontiac's precautions, to learn of the impending attack. Since Pontiac could not risk a direct attack, he tried to keep up his ruse the next day. He returned to Gladwin, smoked a peace pipe with him, and announced that his warriors wished to pay their respects to the garrison to prove their peaceful intentions. When they returned on the morning of the 9th of May, they found the gates locked. Gladwin had seen through the deception. Pontiac now openly declared war. He stated that the British, quote, might stay in our fort, but his warriors, quote, would keep the country. The siege had begun. Mrs. Turnbull and her 2 sons were working in the field in front of their small farm when Pontiac's men appeared. They were the first victims. Then came 2 soldiers who were guarding a herd of cattle on Hog Island, followed by a dozen more Anglo-American settlers. Pontiac was putting his threat into action. He occupied the land in order to intimidate the British and pressure them into withdrawing. The defenders' situation was precarious. For the moment, they were protected by the fort's sturdy palisades, but an inspection revealed that their supplies would not last more than 3 weeks on half rations, and they were too few to defend the fort in the long term. Therefore, the men were relieved when, the next day, a group of unarmed Wyandots appeared beneath the walls and proposed a ceasefire. Gladwin was suspicious, but he allowed his predecessor Donald McCampbell and Lieutenant George MacDougall to go out and meet Pontiac for negotiations. The meeting took place at home of a relative of the fort's last French commander. It had barely begun when Pontiac broke the truce. He had the 2 officers seized and bound, and told Gladwin that he would not release them until the British left the fort and retreated eastward over the mountains. Gladwin, who had used a lull in the fighting to bring supplies into the fort, refused to be blackmailed. He declared that he would not negotiate until Pontiac released the hostages. So the fighting began anew. Soon, warriors swarmed around the fort. They attacked anyone who left the protection of the ramparts and fired over the cover of sheds and houses at the guards on the palisade. In the first few weeks, they killed 20 redcoats and captured 15 more. In response, Gladwin launched several sorties, destroyed everything that could provide cover for the attackers, and positioned 2 cannons to take advantage of the clear line of fire. After the first shots from the guns, the warriors quickly learned to be more cautious. In the meantime, attacks also began across the rest of the Great Lakes region. As if following a coordinated plan, groups of Native Americans simultaneously raided remote British outposts. The first to fall, on the 16th of May, was the small Fort Sandusky on Lake Erie, followed by Fort St. Joseph, Fort Miami, and Fort Weohtanen. All 5 were taken the Native American way, by a stratagem of war. The same fate then befell the first major fortress. On the 2nd of June, a group of Ojibwa were playing lacrosse at their camp near Fort Michilimackinac. The soldiers of the garrison gathered in the shade of the palisades to watch. Soon they were so engrossed that they did not notice several indigenous women slipping quietly through the gate. Then suddenly the ball was thrown into the fort, seemingly by accident, and the players rushed after it, not to retrieve it, but to seize the weapons the women had smuggled in beneath their clothing. Within seconds, the game turned deadly. the Ojibwa surrounded the surprised redcoats, overwhelmed them, and nearly wiped them out. A little further west, in the Ohio Valley, the Delaware and Shawnee attacked Fort Ligonier and then encircled Fort Pitt, while in the east, the Seneca overran Forts Venango, LaBeouf, and Presque Isle, and threatened Fort Niagara. Soon, the entire region was in flames. Pontiac was frustrated. The cannons of Fort Detroit kept his warriors at bay. Support from the other tribes was slow in coming, and the hoped-for alliance with the French settlers in the area failed to materialize. They hesitated to side with Pontiac because they were unsure whether a French army had actually landed in America, as the chief had claimed. Nevertheless, the besiegers worked tirelessly to isolate the fort. The Wyandot and Potawatomi patrolled the Detroit River, while 200 warriors in canoes guarded the river's mouth where it flows into Lake Erie. In mid-May, they intercepted a trader with 5 heavily laden boats carrying goods, including 17 barrels of gunpowder. When Gladwin learned of this, he stationed one of his 2 schooners, the Huron, at the river mouth to prevent such incidents from happening again. Pontiac's warriors soon noticed that there were only 6 soldiers aboard the ship and decided to capture the schooner. As they approached it in their canoes, however, they realized that the firepower of the larger vessel more than compensated for their numerical advantage. In their light boats, they stood no chance against the Huron's 6 cannons. The next day, Pontiac tried a different approach. He sent Campbell in a canoe to the schooner to tell the crew to come ashore to negotiate. The prisoner, however, saw through the plan and gave the sailors a discreet warning that it was a trap. Instead of landing, the Hurons set sail and headed for Niagara to fetch reinforcements. As the Wyandot and Potawatomi followed the schooner along the coast, they came upon a British camp in the woods near Point Pelee. It was the camp of Lieutenant Cornelius Cuyler and his company of Queen's Rangers. They were on their way to Fort Detroit, but were still unaware of the siege. By the time Cuyler realized they were in danger, it was already too late. A man came running out of the woods, screaming, his face contorted with fear. Cuyler had barely gathered from his confused account that his companions had been scalped, when, suddenly, warriors stormed the British camp from all directions. The Rangers ran for their lives, but only about 35 reached the boats. The remaining 60 were surrounded. Those who fell in the melee were, in a sense, the fortunate ones. The prisoners were dragged to Pontiac's camp, where they were tortured, used as practice targets for the boys, or burned at the stake. The mistreatment of the prisoners had repercussions. On the 18th of June, the chiefs of the Ojibwa and the Shawnee arrived at the Detroit River to consult with Pontiac. They were less than enthusiastic about his actions. He had made little progress, acted with unnecessary brutality, and taken food from French settlers, whom they hoped to win over to supply his warriors. Faced with this open criticism, Pontiac realized that his authority was being challenged. When the returning Huron was sighted at the mouth of the Detroit River on the 21st of June, he decided to restore his prestige. He had his warriors prepare an ambush. As the Huron passed Turkey Island, gunshots suddenly rang out. Accompanied by loud war cries, the helmsman steered the ships into the middle of the river to escape the fire from the island. But at the same time, dozens of canoes surged out from behind the small island. The light boats closed in at lightning speed. But the Huron was prepared. When the attackers were just a stone's throw away, the captain gave a signal. 36 soldiers who had been hiding below deck leapt to the rail and opened fire. It was Cuyler and the remnants of his ranger company whom the Huron had taken aboard en route. The expected reinforcements unleashed a sudden burst of firepower that drove the attackers back. The very next day, Pontiac suffered another setback. Lieutenant George McDougall and 3 other prisoners escaped from the Odawa village because the guards had fallen asleep. Campbell, however, did not attempt to escape, as he was rather heavy-set. He would come to bitterly regret it. When Amherst learned in New York that Pontiac had attacked Fort Detroit, he could barely believe his ears. When reports of raids began to pile up, however, the general had to admit that he had underestimated the Native Americans. He immediately raised 2 armies to put an end to the attacks and punish the rebels. Colonel Henry Bouquet advanced into the Ohio Valley to relieve Fort Pitt, while Captain James Dalyell set out for Fort Detroit. Meanwhile, some 900 warriors had gathered at Fort Detroit. That was enough for Pontiac to change his tactics. Instead of continuing to pick off individual guards on the walls, he established a tight blockade to starve the garrison. It was a gamble. Gladwin had food to last several weeks, thanks to the Huron, while the besiegers' supplies were already running low. If Pontiac failed to secure provisions, his men would starve before the garrison did, and worse, they would face winter without stores. To prevent this, Pontiac once again urged the French settlers to support him. The response was modest. Some allowed the indigenous warriors to grow corn in their fields. About 40 young frontier woodsmen, known as coureurs de bois, joined him as volunteers, and a handful of workers helped him build an earthen redoubt near the fort. However, Pontiac's increasingly coercive demands also pushed many French settlers to side with the British. Gladwin gathered this new arrival in the church and read them the terms of the Treaty of Paris. This time they were persuaded. What Pontiac and the other chiefs had claimed was false. The French had not come to reclaim their colonies. On the 4th of July, the garrison launched a sortie to destroy the redoubt, which was almost complete by now. A bloody skirmish ensued, during which the son of the Ojibwa chief, Wesson, was killed. The Ojibwa were outraged and called for retribution. Their anger fell upon the defenseless Campbell. Wesson and several warriors dragged him from the Odawa camp, tied him to the stake Parents Creek. They tortured him, tore out his heart while he was still alive, and threw his body in the creek. Gladwin's retaliatory strike followed immediately. He sent his ships upriver to bombard and destroy the Odawa village. The Odawa subsequently rebuilt their huts in a swamp, far from rivers and roads. The attack made clear to Pontiac once again that the 2 schooners were among Gladwin's most important weapons. He needed to destroy them. To that end, he enlisted the help of the Maloche brothers, who showed his warriors how to build fireships. By the 10th of July, they were ready. The brothers pushed the boats out onto the Detroit River, set them ablaze, and let them drift toward the 2 schooners. The warriors cheered as the flames flared up, and lamented when the fireships burned out before reaching their target. 2 further attempts also failed, and when Gladwin reinforced several smaller boats with fireproofing plating to deflect other fireships, Pontiac abandoned the plan. After this setback, resolve began to waver. Native American warfare did not typically involve prolonged sieges, and as a result, some chiefs were running out of patience. The Potawatomi and Wyandot even offered the garrison a truce. But before they reached an agreement with Gladwin, a messenger arrived. He reported that the Delaware were besieging Fort Pitt. War weariness vanished into thin air. On the morning of the 28th of July, the guards on the palisades heard gunfire. Downstream, where the Wyandot were camped, nothing was happening. Gladwin feared that Pontiac was finally attempting an attack, and immediately sent a dozen volunteers to find out what was going on. The men rowed downstream in a small boat, into the thick morning fog. After a while, they heard the splash of oars. The sound grew louder and louder, until suddenly the outline of a boat emerged from the mist. Then a second, a third, and finally a whole flotilla. But these were not Pontiac's canoes. As the rising sun burned away the fog, the scouts made out 22 boats, and on board, redcoats. Dalyell had arrived. Dalyell was an ambitious young captain, eager to prove himself in battle. He wanted to surprise Pontiac in his camp, destroy him, and use the victory to advance his career. Gladwin, however, considered it naive to attempt a surprise attack on the Odawa. He advocated waiting out the situation at Detroit. The news of the attack on Fort Pitt had certainly galvanized the indigenous forces, but he believed it was only a matter of time before they lost interest in the long, monotonous siege. Although Gladwin was in command, Dalyell ultimately prevailed, invoking his authority as Amherst's aide-de-camp and his status as the son of the baronet. On the 31st of July, at about 2:30 a.m., Dalyell set out accompanied by the famous frontiersman Robert Rogers. 247 men marched north along the river in a double column. 2 boats, each equipped with swivel guns, provided cover from the water. Near Parents Creek, Dalyell shortened the column, formed a vanguard and rearguard, and ordered his men to move in silence. As the first British soldiers crossed the narrow wooden bridge over the creek, all was still quiet. But just a few steps later, arrows and gunfire rained down on them. Several men were hit, including Dalyell, who was only lightly wounded. As the vanguard attempted to withdraw, they heard fighting break out behind them as well. Pontiac had set a trap. 400 warriors had hidden in the woods along the path, waited until the British column had passed, and then struck from the flank and rear. Panic spread. Only Robert Rogers kept his composure. He led his company to a nearby farmstead and turned it into a makeshift blockhouse. Against the picturesque backdrop of the breaking dawn, a brutal scene unfolded. The Redcoats fought bravely, but in disarray. Dozens were cut down or captured before Dalyell finally regained control and rallied his men. Once order was restored, he reformed the rearguard as the vanguard and began retreating toward Detroit. While attempting to break through the attackers' line, he was struck again, this time fatally. Command fell to the leader of the rearguard, Captain Grant, who began fighting his way back toward the fort from cover to cover. Rogers' men were the last to leave. They were only able to abandon the blockhouse once the 2 boats provided covering fire from the river. The blood of the fallen stained Parents Creek red. Since that day, it has been known as the Bloody Run. The senseless Battle of Bloody Run weakened both sides, and for the rest of the summer and into the fall, they focused on conserving their resources. Pontiac controlled the surrounding countryside, while the garrison remained behind its palisades. Both were gradually running out of supplies. In October, Gladwin wrote to Amherst, quote, "The enemy are masters of the country. The season far advanced, not a stick of firewood in the garrison, and but little provisions." End quote. The besiegers were faring little better, and the stalemate on the siege caused Pontiac's influence among the warriors to wane. As a cold wind heralded the coming of winter, more and more warriors left the camp to prepare for the cold season. On the 31st of October, he finally had to admit that the French would not be coming. He lifted the siege and moved south across the Maumee River to continue the resistance against the British there. Fort Detroit remained in British hands for the time being, but the war was not yet over. Thanks again to World of Warships for sponsoring today's video. You can download and play World of Warships for free through my link at the top of the description or the pinned comment. And if you're a new player, use the invite code IMPACTFORCE for additional rewards.